A wolf cub howled in pain, abandoned in the forest. But the hunter's actions shocked everyone. The autumn wind, smelling of rotten leaves and approaching snow, howled in the bare branches of old fir trees as Viktor Prokorovich, a hunter with half a century of experience in the taiga, checked his traps. His wrinkled, weather-beaten face was as calm as the taiga itself, and his eyes, faded from time and constant gazing into the forest, noticed the slightest trace, every broken twig. Today, luck was not on his side. The traps were empty, only red squirrels chattered mockingly from above, and a jay cried out something alarming. Victor was about to turn back toward his home, a good 5 versts away, when he suddenly heard a strange sound. He froze, listening. It was not a bird's cry, a hare's squeak, or a fox's bark. Something thin, plaintive, almost human, came from the thick spruce forest, where the sun rarely shone. The hunter frowned. He knew every rustle and every sound in these parts. But this one was unfamiliar, and therefore caused him vague anxiety. He adjusted the old double-barreled shotgun on his shoulder, his faithful companion for many years, and trying not to make a sound, began to make his way through the thorny thicket. The wind died down, and the crying became louder, desperate, intermittent. Victor pushed aside a low-hanging fir branch and saw it. Under the upturned roots of an old pine tree that had been felled by a storm, in a small hollow lined with dry needles, lay a tiny gray lump. A wolf cub. Completely blind, barely covered with sparse fur, it was desperately poking its snout into the cold ground and whimpering, trembling with its entire tiny body. Nearby, there were fresh tracks of a large wolf leading deeper into the thicket. But the mother was nowhere to be seen. Victor looked around. There was no sign of her. Had she abandoned it? Or had something gone wrong? The hunter crouched down, and the wolf cub, as if sensing a stranger's presence, whimpered even louder, writhing and trying to crawl away. The old hunter's heart, accustomed to the harsh reality of the taiga, where only the strongest survive, suddenly trembled. He had seen death many times, had taken the lives of animals himself. But this helpless squeaking lump, doomed to a slow death from hunger and cold, aroused in his soul a feeling he had never known before, a sharp, almost painful pity. He understood that a wolf was a wolf, a future predator, a threat to domestic animals and forest game. To leave it here would be to let nature take its course. Should he shoot it? Put it out of its misery? His hand reached for his rifle, his fingers closed around the cold metal. But something stopped him. His gaze fell on the tiny, blindly closed eyes, on the quivering nose desperately drawing in the cold air. Before we continue, let us know which city you are from. We are interested to know where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's begin. Viktor Prokorovich stared motionless at the wolf cub for a few more moments, struggling with himself. He had been a hunter all his life, and wolves had always been his enemies, intelligent, dangerous, but enemies nonetheless. He remembered the old men's stories about wolf raids, about slaughtered sheep and calves, about the fear these gray predators instilled in the inhabitants of the taiga villages. And now one of them lay before him, tiny and defenseless, inspiring not fear, but only a poignant sympathy. "Oh, you foundling," he muttered at last, and there was an unfamiliar note in his voice. He slowly took the well-worn canvas backpack off his shoulder and took out an old but clean piece of cloth, which he usually used to wrap bread. Then, trying to move as carefully as possible, he picked up the wolf cub with 2 rough but surprisingly nimble fingers. It squeaked and froze, feeling the unexpected warmth of human hands. Victor carefully wrapped it in the cloth, then tucked it into the bosom of his old but warm sheepskin coat. The tiny body immediately pressed against him, and the plaintive squeaking stopped. "Come on, little one. Let's see what you'll grow up to be," sighed the hunter, getting up. He looked once more at the place where he had found the wolf cub, as if trying to guess the fate of its mother. But all around was the silence of the autumn forest, broken only by the howling of the wind in the treetops. The way back to the village seemed surprisingly short, even though his legs were tired and the unexpected burden in his bosom was quietly sniffling. Victor thought about what his wife, Maria, would say. She certainly wouldn't be happy with such a gift. But the thought of turning back and returning the wolf cub to the forest did not even occur to him. Something in this tiny, helpless creature touched the deepest chords of his soul, making him forget the long-standing enmity between man and wolf. He walked, holding his precious burden in his arms, and for the first time in many years, he felt like more than just a hunter, but someone greater, perhaps a savior, or maybe just a man who couldn't pass by someone else's misfortune, even if that misfortune belonged to a wolf. When Viktor Prokorovich crossed the threshold of his hut, his wife Maria, who was bustling about the stove, turned around and immediately noticed something unusual in his behavior. He was quieter than usual, and his gaze was fixed somewhere inside himself. "Well, Hunter? Empty-handed again?" she asked, not expecting anything. Victor silently walked over to the bench, carefully unbuttoned his coat, and pulled out a gray, squeaking lump. Maria gasped and took a step back, wiping her hands on her apron. "What on earth is this? My God, it's a wolf cub." Her voice was a mixture of surprise, disbelief, and obvious fear. "I found it in the forest. It was alone, without its mother," Victor explained briefly, carefully placing the cub on an old sheepskin rug that he had hastily pulled from the bed. The wolf cub immediately began to fidget, poking around blindly with its snout and whimpering pitifully. "Victor, have you lost your mind? You brought a wolf into the house. You have to kill it before it grows up." Maria threw up her hands, her face expressing a whole range of emotions, from fear to indignation. "Look at him, Maria. He's blind. He won't survive on his own." Victor looked at his wife with such a look that she fell silent. She knew that look. It was the look he gave her when he had made up his mind, and it was impossible to change it. "But he's a predator, Vitya. When he grows up, he'll be a disaster. He'll kill our chickens and start stealing the neighbor's livestock. What will people say?" She wouldn't let up, though her voice was no longer so confident. "We'll see. In the meantime, we have to take care of him," Victor replied curtly. He went to the stove, took the cast-iron pot with the cooled milk, and poured some into a saucer. But the wolf cub was too small to lap it up. Then Victor remembered how he had once nursed orphaned kittens. He dipped his finger in the milk and carefully brought it to the wolf cub's muzzle. At first, it recoiled, but then, sensing the smell, it began to smack its lips greedily, trying to grab his finger with its tiny but already sharp teeth. Mary watched the scene, shaking her head, but there was no longer any hostility in her eyes, rather curiosity and a kind of involuntary sympathy. The first night was restless. The wolf cub often woke up squeaking, demanding food and warmth. Victor hardly slept, getting up every few minutes to feed him and wrap him up warmer. Maria grumbled, but by morning she brought an old woolen shawl and made a warm nest for the foundling in a wicker basket by the stove. Days passed. Victor made a kind of nipple for the wolf cub out of a piece of cloth and a bottle, and feeding became easier. He named him Liuti, either to mock his current helplessness or with a view to his future wolf nature. Liuti quickly learned. A week later, he opened his eyes. Cloudy blue like all newborn predators. They looked at the world around them with curiosity and not yet fully comprehending. He began to try to stand up on his clumsy legs, spreading them out comically and immediately falling back onto his stomach. Maria, although she tried to remain strict, found herself smiling more and more often as she watched his clumsy attempts to discover the world. She was still afraid of his future nature. But this small, warm bundle, clinging so desperately to life, could not fail to arouse sympathy. Victor spent all his free time with Liutim. He spoke to him in a soft, cooing voice, stroking his soft fur, which grew thicker every day and took on a characteristic grayish-brown hue. The old hunter seemed to have grown younger at heart. His usually stern face softened when he looked at his pet, and his eyes took on that special gleam that only people who have found a new, unexpected attachment have. Rumors about the unusual tenant in the Prokorovich house quickly spread throughout the village. The villagers reacted in different ways. The old folks shook their heads and predicted trouble. No matter how you feed a wolf, it will always look toward the forest, they said. The hunters laughed at Victor, considering him an eccentric who had lost his mind in his old age. Prokhorich, have you decided to tame a wolf? Are you going to take it hunting with you? They teased him when they saw him. The women were openly afraid and forbade their children to go near Victor's house. There's a wolf living there, an evil, scary one, they whispered, crossing themselves. Victor stoically endured all the ridicule and sidelong glances. He didn't argue with anyone, didn't try to prove anything, just continued to care for Ludo, as if he didn't notice the gossip. He understood that his actions went against all established norms, but he couldn't back down now. This little wolf cub had become something more to him than just a rescued animal. He had become a kind of challenge, a challenge to himself, his habits, his beliefs. Lut grew not by days, but by hours. His murky blue puppy eyes changed color, becoming piercing yellow with dark, attentive pupils, real wolf eyes, intelligent and alert. His fur thickened and took on a beautiful silvery sheen on his back and sides. His clumsy paws grew stronger, and he no longer crawled but ran quite nimbly around the hut, exploring every corner and sniffing at all the new objects. His games became more and more wolf-like. He loved to drag Victor's old felt boots around, tearing them apart, growling and shaking his head, or ambushing the broom that Mary used to sweep the floor with. Once he managed to snatch a piece of dried meat from the table that Victor had saved for himself, and with a satisfied grunt, he gobbled it up in a secluded corner under the bench. Victor just smiled. Well, predator, nothing to say. Maria just threw up her hands, but she couldn't scold Liutoy seriously anymore. He looked too funny with his guilty face and the remains of the treat sticking out of his mouth. The Prokhorovich's old dog, Burin, a shaggy and wise yard guard, initially treated the newcomer with open hostility. He growled, bared his teeth, and wouldn't let Liutoy near his bowl. But the wolf cub, not understanding the dog's threats, reached out to the big dog with naive curiosity, trying to lick his nose or grab his tail. Gradually, old Burin's heart melted. He stopped growling, allowed Liuti to sleep next to him, snuggling up to his warm side, and sometimes even played with him indulgently, gently grabbing him by the scruff of the neck with his powerful jaws. Victor watched this unusual friendship with quiet joy. He saw how Liuti learned dog habits from Burin, but at the same time retained his wolf nature, independence, caution, and a sharp mind. When Liuti grew so large that he became cramped in the hut, Victor moved him to a spacious enclosure that he built himself in the backyard. The enclosure was sturdy, with a high mesh fence and a cozy doghouse insulated with hay. At first, Liuti missed the warmth of the hut and the company of people. But he quickly got used to his new home, especially since Victor still spent a lot of time with him, walking him on a long leash in the nearby forest or just sitting next to the enclosure, talking to him as if he were an intelligent being. Several months passed. Liuti turned into a young, strong wolf, graceful and beautiful. His yellow eyes looked at the world with that special wolf wisdom that seemed to hold the memory of all his wild ancestors. The villagers, seeing Victor walking his pet, no longer laughed, but looked on with caution and involuntary respect. Some even struck up conversations with Victor, asking about Liut, but most still kept their distance. One day in late autumn, when the first frost had already covered the ground and the trees had finally shed their leaves, an incident occurred that made Victor look at his protégé in a new light. As usual, he went into the forest to check his snares, leaving Liu Toi in the enclosure. At that time, Maria had gone to a neighbor's house to help with salting cabbage. When Victor returned, he saw that the gate to the enclosure was wide open and Liu Togo was nowhere to be seen. The hunter's heart sank with alarm. He searched the entire yard, looked in the barn and the woodshed, but the wolf was nowhere to be found. Victor was already beginning to worry seriously when he suddenly heard muffled barking and some kind of growling coming from the chicken coop. He rushed there and saw a scene that took his breath away. Liuti was standing at the door of the chicken coop, pressing a huge red fox to the ground. The fox was writhing desperately, trying to break free, but the wolf held her firmly by the scruff of her neck, growling menacingly. The chickens were running around the coop in panic, clucking and flapping their wings. Victor realized what had happened. The fox, taking advantage of the owner's absence, had decided to feast on the chickens, but Liuti somehow managing to get out of the enclosure. Later, Victor discovered that the wolf had managed to bend the bars of the fence in one place, blocked her way. He did not attack the fox, but only held her back, preventing her from reaching the chickens. Victor pushed Liuti away, and the fox, tucking her tail between her legs, darted toward the forest. Liuti, breathing heavily, approached Victor and nudged his hand with his muzzle, as if seeking praise. Victor patted him on the back. "Well done, Liuti, a real guard." At that moment, he realized that his wolf was not just a wild animal he had tamed, but a loyal and intelligent friend, capable of protecting his home and his loved ones. This incident further strengthened the bond between man and wolf, but it also added to Victor's worries. He understood that sooner or later, Liuti would outgrow the confines of human habitation, and the call of the wild might prove stronger than any attachment. As time passed, Liuti began to look more and more like a mature, seasoned wolf. His muscles bulged with strength, his fur glistened in the sun, and his gaze became even more piercing and meaningful. Victor began to take him on short walks in the forest, first on a leash, and then, once he was sure of his obedience, without it. Liuti behaved with surprising restraint in the forest. He did not chase squirrels or scare birds, but walked alongside Victor, carefully sniffing the tracks left by other animals and glancing at his master from time to time, as if asking for permission. Victor taught him the wisdom of the forest. He showed him how to determine the direction of the wind, how to read tracks, and how to find his way by landmarks. Liuti absorbed everything like a sponge, and his natural intelligence and instincts, combined with his trust in humans, made him a unique creature. A wolf that had retained its wild nature, but was deeply attached to its savior. Once, when they were returning from the forest, a huge boar jumped out of the bushes, enraged and dangerous. Victor didn't even have time to raise his gun before Liuti rushed forward, standing between him and the boar. He did not attack, but only growled menacingly, baring his fangs and crouching low, ready to pounce. The boar, taken aback by such an unexpected obstacle, froze for a moment, then snorted, turned, and disappeared into the thicket. Victor then stroked Liuti's head for a long time, thanking him for saving him. "You are my protector, Grey One," he whispered. And the wolf, as if understanding his words, whimpered softly and rubbed his muzzle against his hand. Rumors of this incident quickly spread throughout the village, and attitudes toward Liuti began to change. Those who had previously feared him and condemned Victor now looked at the wolf with involuntary respect. It seems that Prochorus was right to take him in. "He's become one of us, since he protects his master," said the men as they gathered at the well in the evening. Maria, who had been so afraid of Liuti at first, now brought him a bowl of food herself and spoke kindly to him when Victor went hunting. She saw how devoted the wolf was to her husband, and her woman's heart could not help but respond to this silent but strong affection. However, the older Liuti grew, the more often Victor noticed signs of longing for freedom in his behavior. Sometimes, especially at night, the wolf would raise his head to the moon and let out a long, mournful howl, the call of his ancestors, the song of the wild nature that lived in his blood. Victor understood that he could not keep him with him forever. That year, the winter was unusually harsh. The snow fell early and lay deep and thick, making it difficult for both people and animals to move around. The frost was so severe that birds froze in mid-flight, and the trees in the forest groaned and cracked in the cold. Despite his age, Victor Prokorovich was forced to go into the forest more often than usual. His firewood supplies were running low, and fresh meat was essential in such bitter cold. Ludi was particularly restless during those days. He paced around his enclosure, whimpering, and when Victor let him out for a walk, he greedily sniffed the frosty air and stared at the forest for a long time, as if trying to hear or see something. On one of those frosty days, Victor decided to check the snares he had set for martens. Maria tried to dissuade him. "Where are you going, old man, in such cold weather? You'll catch a cold and get sick, and there's so much snow on the ground you won't be able to get through." But Victor was adamant. "I have to, Maria. I have to. Marten fur is in high demand these days, and it's good to get some fresh air." He dressed warmly, took his rifle and skis, and went out into the yard. Liuti, seeing him getting ready, became agitated and began to jump and whine, begging to go with him. Victor hesitated. Taking the wolf on such a long trip was risky, but leaving him alone, longing in his enclosure, was also a pity. "Well, let's go, Grey One. Just keep your eyes on me and don't get into any trouble," he finally decided. Liuti barked happily and jumped around his master. They left the village as the sun was just rising above the snow-covered forest. The frost was getting stronger, the snow crunched under their skis, and their breath instantly turned into clouds of steam. Liuti ran alongside, sometimes racing ahead, sometimes returning to Victor, his yellow eyes burning with excitement. The forest was silent, frozen by the cold, with only the occasional creaking of old pine trees in the wind. Victor walked slowly, looking around carefully. He knew these places well, but winter had changed everything beyond recognition, and even familiar paths were lost under the deep snow. After several hours of walking, they reached the place where the snares had been set. Unfortunately, they were unlucky here too. All the traps were empty. Victor sighed, but he wasn't too upset. Hunting is hunting. You can't always guess what will happen. He decided to rest a little before heading back, sat down on a fallen tree, took a thermos of hot tea and a piece of bread with lard out of his backpack. While Victor was drinking tea, Liuti circled restlessly around him, sniffing the snow and listening to the rustling of the forest. Suddenly, he froze, raised his head, and growled hoarsely, looking toward a thick spruce forest. The hair on his neck stood on end. "What's there, Gray?" Victor asked, setting down the thermos. He knew that Liuti never growled without a reason. The wolf took a few steps forward, keeping his eyes on the fir trees, and growled again, louder and more menacingly. Victor stood up and raised his rifle. He peered into the dark thicket, trying to see anything, but saw nothing. The silence that had reigned in the forest seemed ominous to him. And then, slowly, rolling from paw to paw, a huge brown bear emerged from behind the fir trees. Hungry, angry, and not yet settled in its den, it was deadly dangerous. The bear noticed the men and the wolf, stopped, rose on its hind legs, and let out a low, guttural growl. Its small, angry eyes were fixed on Victor. The hunter's heart skipped a beat. He knew that an encounter with a brown bear in the winter forest almost always ended in tragedy. He raised his rifle, but he knew that one shot was unlikely to stop such a beast, and he might not have time to reload. The bear roared and charged at them, breaking bushes and leaving deep tracks in the snow. At this critical moment, Liuti, without a second thought, threw himself in front of the bear. He clung to its side, distracting the huge predator's attention. The bear roared in pain and rage, turned around, and struck the wolf with its powerful paw. Liuti yelped, flew to the side, but immediately jumped up again and rushed at the beast, this time trying to grab its hind leg. This desperate attack gave Victor a few precious seconds. He took aim and fired. The bullet struck the bear in the chest. It roared again, swayed, but remained on its feet. Victor feverishly reloaded his rifle, while the fierce wolf, despite the blow it had received, continued to circle the bear, biting its paws and preventing it from approaching its master. Victor's second shot was more successful. The bear growled, stumbled backward, and collapsed heavily onto the snow, staining it with its dark blood. It convulsed for a few moments, then fell silent. Silence reigned in the forest, broken only by Victor's heavy breathing and Liutoi's intermittent whimpering. The hunter lowered his rifle, his legs buckling from the strain. He approached Liutoi. The wolf lay in the snow, his wounded paw tucked under him, blood oozing from it. "Liutoi, my dear, how are you?" Victor knelt down beside him, his voice trembling. The wolf raised his head and licked his hand, as if to calm him. The wound was serious. The bear had torn his side badly with its claws. Victor took the remains of a canvas rag from his backpack, which he had once used to wrap Fierce when he was a puppy, and bandaged the wound as best he could. "Hang in there, Gray One, hang in there. We'll make it home," he said, stroking the wolf's head. The way back was difficult. Liuti, limping and whimpering in pain, walked alongside his master with his last ounce of strength. Victor tried to walk more slowly, but he knew he had to hurry. The wolf was losing blood, and the frost could make his condition worse. When they finally reached the village, it was already dusk. When Maria saw them, she clapped her hands and rushed toward them. "My God, what happened?" "Victor, Liuti." Her voice was full of alarm. Victor briefly recounted his encounter with the bear, and Maria, forgetting her earlier fears, immediately began to help her husband. They carried Liuti into the hut and laid him on a warm bed by the stove. Maria, a former nurse, skillfully treated the wound, washed it with herbal decoction, and applied a tight bandage. Liuti endured all the procedures stoically, only occasionally whimpering and looking trustingly at his rescuers. All night long, Victor and Maria stayed by his side, giving him warm water to drink and changing his bandages. The old hunter felt guilty. It was he who had taken Liuti into the forest, and it was because of him that the wolf had been injured. But at the same time, his heart was filled with pride and gratitude. If it weren't for Liuti, he, Victor, might not be alive. The wolf saved his life, paying for it with his own blood. That night was a turning point in their relationship. Liuti finally ceased to be just a wolf to Maria. He became a member of their small family, a creature deserving of love and care. And Victor was once again convinced that the decision he had made long ago in the autumn forest was the only right one. Liuti recovered slowly. The wound was deep, and for the first few days he hardly got up, only drinking water and eating a little of what Maria brought him. Warm milk and finely chopped meat. Victor spent all his time with him, talking, stroking him, and encouraging him. He saw how his faithful friend was suffering, and his heart ached with pity. The news of how the wolf had saved the hunter from the bear quickly spread throughout the village. Now no one laughed at Victor or called him a weirdo. His fellow villagers came to his house, brought Liutomu gifts, some a piece of meat, some a bowl of milk, and asked about his health. They looked at the wolf with respect and a kind of superstitious fear. After all, he had not only saved a man, he had challenged the most fearsome predator in the forest. The old gamekeeper, Yegor Kuzmich, who used to tease Victor the most, came one day and sat for a long time by Liutoi's bed, shaking his head. "That's how it is, Prokhorich," he said at last. "Live and learn. I thought a wolf was just a wolf, thinking only of its own skin. But yours is special. He has a human soul, no doubt about it." Victor said nothing, just smiled slightly. He knew that Liuti's soul was as wolfish as they come. Loyal, brave, ready to sacrifice himself for those he considered his own. 2 weeks later, Liuti began to slowly get back on his feet. He was still limping badly, but he was already trying to walk around the hut, sniffing familiar corners. Victor took him out for short walks in the yard, supporting him by the side. The wolf greedily breathed in the fresh, frosty air, and a sparkle reappeared in his yellow eyes. Spring came early that year. The sun grew warmer, the snow began to melt, and the first streams began to sing in the forest. Liuti had almost completely recovered from his wound. Only a small scar on his side reminded him of his encounter with the bear. He became lively and strong again. But something new appeared in his behavior, a kind of adult seriousness and thoughtfulness. He was still devoted to Victor, following him everywhere and sleeping at his feet. But Victor increasingly noticed how Liuti would sit for long periods at the gate. Looking toward the forest, his eyes filled with longing for freedom and his wild kin. One warm April morning, when the forest was already covered with a delicate green haze and the air smelled of young leaves and thawing earth, Victor let Liuti out into the yard as usual. The wolf frolicked a little, played with old Burin, and then approached the gate leading to the forest and stopped. He stood there for a long time, motionless, looking into the thicket, from where the inviting smells and sounds of the spring forest came. Then he turned around, looked at Victor with a long, piercing gaze, as if saying goodbye, and whimpered softly. Victor understood everything. His heart ached at the impending separation, but he knew he had no right to keep Liuti. A wolf must live where nature intended it to live, in the forest, among its own kind. "Go, Liuti, go," he said quietly, opening the gate. "You are free. Just don't forget us." Liuti looked at him once more, then at Maria, who had come out onto the porch, licked Victor's hand, and without looking back, disappeared into the forest. Victor and Maria stood at the gate for a long time, watching him go. Tears rolled down the old hunter's wrinkled cheeks. But they were not only tears of sadness, but also of a kind of bright melancholy. He had done everything he could, saved the life of a small, helpless creature, raised him, given him his love and care, and now he was setting him free, giving him a chance to live his own wolf's life. The days dragged on without Liuti. The yard was empty, and even old Buran seemed to miss his unusual friend. Victor often went into the forest, hoping to meet Liuti, but he did not show up. Only sometimes at night, a long wolf howl would come from deep in the forest, and Victor knew that it was Liuti sending him his regards. The villagers also noticed the wolf's absence. "So, your Liuti is gone?" they asked Victor. "Gone," he replied, "to where he belongs." And no one condemned him or laughed at him anymore. Everyone understood that the story of Victor and Liuti was not just a coincidence, but something more, a special connection between man and wild nature, which is so rare and therefore so precious. Summer passed and autumn came. Victor still went hunting, but without the same enthusiasm. He missed Liutoy, his intelligent eyes, his silent presence. One day, late in the fall, when the forest was already preparing for its winter sleep, Victor was returning home from hunting. Luck had once again turned its back on him, and his backpack was almost empty. He was walking, lost in thought, when suddenly he heard the crack of branches and a muffled growl nearby. Victor became alert and took his rifle from his shoulder. He recognized that voice. It was how Fierce growled when he was alarmed or angry. The hunter moved cautiously toward the sound and soon came out into a small clearing. What he saw made his heart stop. In the clearing, surrounded by a pack of 5 mature wolves, stood Liuti. He was alone against 5, and it looked like a fight was about to break out. The wolves slowly closed in, their eyes burning with rage, and a low, threatening growl came from their bared fangs. Liuti stood in the center, crouched low to the ground, ready to sell his life dearly. The fur on his mane stood on end, his fangs bared. Victor realized that this was a foreign pack, and that Liuti had apparently wandered into their territory. In the world of wolves, such encounters often end in the death of the lone wolf. Victor's hand reached for the trigger of his rifle. He could have intervened, scared the pack away with shots, but something stopped him. This was not his fight. This was Liuti's world, his laws, his trials, and Liuti had to go through this himself. One of the wolves, the largest, apparently the leader, took a step forward and lunged at Liuti. He dodged the attack and in turn grabbed the leader by the side. A fierce fight ensued. The other wolves did not interfere, watching the duel. Liuti fought desperately, using all the strength, agility, and intelligence that Victor had taught him. He was wounded, blood oozing from his shoulder, but he did not give up. The leader was also badly battered, but his fury and experience were winning out. Victor stood, unable to move, his heart pounding like a madman's. He knew that if Liuti lost, he would be torn to pieces. But he also knew that Liuti would not give up without a fight. And then, just when it seemed that Liuti's strength was running out, he managed to land a blow on the leader that made him howl in pain and retreat. Liuti did not give him time to recover, lunging forward again, and the leader, unable to withstand the pressure, tucked his tail between his legs and fled. The other wolves, seeing their leader's defeat, also disappeared into the forest after a moment's hesitation. Fierce remained alone in the clearing, breathing heavily. He was covered in blood, his fur was ruffled, but he stood on his feet, victorious. Victor slowly emerged from behind the trees. Liuti, hearing his footsteps, turned around. There was no fear in his eyes, only fatigue and a kind of grim determination. He recognized Victor but did not rush toward him as he had before, only whimpering softly and lowering his head. Victor approached him and knelt down. "Looty, you're alive." His voice trembled with excitement. He examined the wolf's wounds. They were serious, but not fatal. "Let's go home, Grey One. I'll take care of you," said Victor, trying to hug the wolf. But Laiuti pushed him away. He looked at Victor with a long, farewell glance, in which gratitude and some kind of incomprehensible longing could be seen, and quietly licked his hand. Then, turning around, he slowly wandered deeper into the forest, to where the pack he had defeated had disappeared. Victor understood that Laiuti would not return. He had chosen his path, the path of a free wolf. He had proven his right to be the leader, and now a different life awaited him. The old hunter stood in the clearing for a long time, watching his gray friend walk away. His heart was filled with the bitterness of parting and pride in Laiuti. He had raised not just a tame wolf, but a true king of the forest, strong, brave, and able to stand up for himself. Returning home, Victor thought about how strangely the fates of man and beast were intertwined. He, a hunter who had considered wolves his enemies all his life, had saved and raised one of them. And that wolf, in turn, had saved his life and taught him something very important: that love and loyalty know no boundaries and do not depend on whether you are a man or a wolf. Victor never saw Laiuti again. But sometimes, at night, when the full moon rose over the taiga, he heard a distant but familiar wolf howl, the song of his gray friend, a song of freedom and wild, unbridled power. And the old hunter smiled, knowing that somewhere out there, in the endless taiga, lived his Laiuti, his wolf, his forest king. And this thought warmed his heart, filling it with a quiet, bright joy. Life went on, and there was always room in it for a miracle called loyalty.